down at UC Riverside. I'm glad to see so many folks from Cal State San Bernardino. I taught there for about 10 years, so I'm very, very happy to see a good showing from San Bernardino. And so what I do is I teach a lot about policy, and Neville actually asked me to come in about 4 years ago and start teaching about environmental policy. And so that's what a lot of my work is, looking at policy formation, the policy making process. And so when you look at policy making, it's analogous to sausage making. You know, it's not really pretty, but the end result sometimes is tasty, or sometimes it's really bloody. And so honestly, you don't know how it's going to turn out. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through some basic definitions, some terminology, because a lot of what the roundtable was talking about was environmental policy. And so, in fact, I want to take us a step back so we kind of understand what this means and how these work come about. The gentleman who left from Borak's mine was talking about Samara and California regulations and US regulations, and how do we get to these points? How does this actually happen? And so it's important to understand, because not everybody likes it. Not everybody's happy. And one of the things you'll learn in the policy making process is it's really difficult to make everyone happy. In fact, it's nigh impossible for that to happen. So let's go with some basic definitions. What is environmental policy? Environmental policy refers to deliberate actions taken by the government, whether it's state or federal. And what the government is trying to do is manage the activities of the population in order to prevent, reduce, or alleviate, excuse me, that's what you get when you have no caffeine, any harmful effects on nature and its natural resources. So once again, what is the state or federal government trying to do? Manage the population in order to prevent, reduce, or alleviate any harmful effects on nature and on natural resources. These kind of policies aim to ensure that any man-made changes to the environment does not result in any harm to its population. There is a feedback effect. In other words, what happens to the environment ultimately ends up affecting humans as well. So we often forget that process. So in essence, the argument is made by some that by protecting or enhancing the environment, you're also enhancing the human population. And so there's this effect that's taking place. Now, the United States follows an environmental policy that aims to protect the environment for future generations with minimum interference on commercial efficiency and personal liberty of the people. And there's the tension. Because often what happens with policy making, in order to have effective policy, it often comes at the expense of commercial efficiency or personal liberty. Personal liberty is like, I want to have a luscious lawn in the desert. And of course, what do we all know? And I bring this up with my American government students, and I ask them, how many of you have lawns? A third of them raise their hands. How many of you know we probably shouldn't have lawns? They say, we don't care, we want a lawn. I want a pool. You see what I'm saying? Those are the personal liberties. Or commercial efficiency. It might be more efficient for a company to produce minerals in a particular manner, but because of reclamation and because of mitigation policies, it's less efficient. And what that means is it cuts into the actual profits of the industry. Now, some industries are smart about this and they budget ahead of time. Other industries aren't that smart about things, and they struggle in the long run to try and manage these type of inefficiencies, or what is known in economics as externalities. Externalities are costs that are unassociated with traditional production, such as labor or materials or transportation. So externalities are often what pollution is labeled under. These are extra costs, so to speak. And so it's only recently in the past 20 years that environmental economics as a field has developed to try and actually put a dollar value to these externalities that you see. Now, the U.S. government policy is contained, its basis is a National Environmental Policy Act. And that's the basis from which you see a lot of policy that exists today in the United States in regards to policies in regards to the environment. Now, when we are looking at policies, there are different types of policies that exist. And there's about 4 major ones, and I focus on 3 of them here. And environmental policies, you'll see environmental policies that do all 3. The first one is distributive. Distributive policy are government policy that supports private activities that are beneficial to society, but that would not usually be undertaken by the private sector. So for example, certain kinds of medical research are really, really expensive. and they have very little, if any, financial rewards to companies that are involved. So what happens is the government may give grants to these biotech companies down by UC San Diego, and these grants are then used to offset the costs by private industry in order to find maybe some kind of pill that can help folks with diabetes. Have you noticed that new pill that they've just had a breakthrough in regards to a particular, what's that?
Metformin?
No, not metformin. Just recently, last week, I don't know if you guys were watching in the news, just had a breakthrough in regards to maybe trying to create a particular kind of medicine that can help folks with diabetes. So most of these come from government grants. Otherwise, companies wouldn't have the money or the time to invest in them. This is what we call distributive policy. So farmers, this happens with farming. Farmers need support through the bad times if they're going to produce agricultural products on a regular basis. In other words, the Farming Bureau will help farmers when times are bad, when there's a drought, when there's something wrong with the seeds. There's something there they'll help them through, so that we call them subsidies. And these subsidies are there to help farmers because we want farmers to survive, so that way we're not reliant on other countries. In fact, this program actually took place because of the Cold War. Most of it happened under Eisenhower because Eisenhower wanted us to be self-reliant for food, so that way in case we ever got into a big war, we could feed ourselves. So policy drives a lot of this, and this distributive is that we want to take government money, our tax money, spend it on private reasons, but the reasons that will in the end help everybody. Regulatory policy is what you're normally used to when you think about government. Regulatory policy protects the public by regulating private activities. For example, it may prohibit certain actions, such as emitting sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Or it may also require some activities, such as building taller smokestacks with scrubbers, or inspecting automobiles, or forcing communities to recycle waste. And when you look at most environmental policy, it falls into that regulatory category. And that's what we're most familiar with. The third type that you're seeing, and it's becoming more common, is that of redistributive policy. Redistributive policy is an attempt to shift wealth, income, or other resources from the haves to the have-nots. It's what you hear in the news, the redistribution of wealth from one group to another. Now, it's controversial, obviously, because unlike other policies, there's clearly defined winners and clearly defined losers. Whereas in distributive, pretty much everybody benefits from government tax money being spent. In regulatory, it's keeping you from doing things or asking you to do things. And where in redistributive, it's saying, you know what? This group deserves more protection, or this group deserves funding because of what's happened to them in the past. So examples will include anybody that works in environmental justice. So the Environmental Justice and Advocacy Network that's down in the Harupa Valley. What they do is they secure government grants to actually fight the trucking industry and the warehouse industry because they don't like how all the warehouses have popped up in rural Miraloma. What was once a farming community is now all trucks and all warehouses. And so when you talk to Peggy Newman down there, who is the director for the group, she talks a lot about how this is affecting the children. And the children are not, they're suffering from asthma and they're struggling with different disorders. Now, she argues, and others argue in environmental justice, that the reason why they put the warehouses in places like Miraloma is that the folks are mostly undereducated or are less informed. Because they're not going to put this in Carlsbad. You know, when a wealthier community isn't going to feel the effects of environmental waste as poor communities are. In fact, there's a history of putting waste facilities in underprivileged neighborhoods consistently. This is not too surprising why when you talk to folks down the hill and you talk to them about the big solar project that's going out in Apple Valley, and most of their attitude is, well, who cares? It's all desert. No one lives out there. That's the attitude, right? Not in my backyard. Don't put it in my backyard. Put it in someone else's backyard. Well, whose backyard are you going to put it in? Think about it. What's that?
Back in their yard.
Well, whose backyard is it going to go in? Somebody's, right? I mean, this is logic, right? Whose backyard does it go in? Those who probably have the least voice. So redistributive policy is those who try to shift that voice back to those who have no voice, usually by redirecting funding or fining folks, fining companies, and having that money go back to the community. Again, very controversial, is it not? Yeah, because essentially what the courts are doing and what government is doing is picking winners and losers. Very clearly, so it's extremely controversial. But these are the types of policies that you see when looking at the environment. Now, what I want to show you here is graphically how these policies work so you get a better understanding. So how distributive policy will work is Group A support wants support for more benefits. They then put pressure on representatives for more benefits to Group A. Then there's willingness to support other groups to get what you want. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Quid pro quo, or also known as log rolling. I don't know if you guys have been familiar with those terms before. Log rolling is when you try to balance. You ever seen people on a log, right? And then you get 3 or 4 people all trying to balance at the same time. They're trying to balance each other's interests. Or quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. What I give you, you give me. In other words, the Chinese call it guan qi. In other words, I help you out, what will happen later on? You help me out. Yeah, this is the classic design within distributive policy. So willingness to support others to get what they want, which then leads to log rolling activity, and then the benefits come to interest group A. Then what happens is those benefits that you supported go to other groups. Then the other group's support asks for more benefits. Then they're put pressure on representation for their benefits, but then they're also willing to support other groups to get what they want. And then you guys see how the cycle works. You guys see this?
Yeah.
This is interest group practice at its best and at its worst. If it functions well, people benefit. If there's what we call an iron triangle, where you get the government agency, a corporation, and some type of private entity, and they have a lock on this process, other folks can't get in, then there's no changes being made. So at its best, you see a lot of changes happen in American society because people balance interests. This is what we call a pluralistic society. In a pluralistic society, what happens is government attempts to balance the interests of many groups. And so we do live in a pluralistic society. All groups have a voice. Some political scientists argue that when these voices come together, it makes the heavenly chorus of democracy. Heavenly choir, I should say, excuse me, not chorus. The heavenly choir of democracy. However, some have argued that that heavenly choir sings with a distinct upper class accent. So lots of room for debate there. Now let's look at how it looks in regards to regulatory activities. Regulatory activity, there's an activity that harms people. And there are groups, let's say, that are harmed by business practices. Then there's mobilization of a coalition for regulation. There's pressure to regulate. Then regulation on business practices come about. Then there's harm to business profits because of this regulation. Businesses are harmed by regulation, so business interest coalitions mobilize in response, and then there's pressure to deregulate the industry. And this goes back and forth, back and forth. And it often sways with who's in power. Often Republicans are more in favor of deregulating industry. Democrats tend to be more in favor of regulating industry, generally speaking. I generalize here because that's not always the case. You can definitely see Democrats will deregulate in some areas and Republicans who will regulate in other areas. But generally speaking, that's what you tend to see. So this is how the regulatory process works, and you can just map this onto the environmental process. You can see sort of how this can take place. Now, the last one is redistributive. Problems are accumulating for the less powerful group. For example, it could be emissions from trucks down in Miraloma. It could be down in San Diego, down over in Barrio Logan, where they want to actually put more businesses, and they just had a measure to try and prevent that from happening. There's lots of different places where people feel pressured because of environmental pressure points, so to speak. One of the more famous ones that got Peggy Newman and others in Riverside involved is one of the first Superfund sites down in Pedley, near where I grew up over there in Riverside. There was a production facility that produced missiles, and so a lot of the chemicals from the missiles percolate actually seeped into the ground, and children in Pedley were having abnormal rates of thyroid cancer, just skyrocketing. When you look at cancer rates and you map them GIS style, you can actually see clusters. And when you see these clusters, you start asking why. And so Newman and others actually sued, and they won. And they were one of the first people to actually win in the Supreme Court case back in 1984 to have a Superfund site come there and actually say, you know what, they need to clean this up. as it was the percolate that was causing a lot of these cancer. They had argued that this was the causal link between this. Yes?
I was just going to ask that. I mean, let's just say that's a direct cause going to be like a number of other factors. Isn't it just like the whole idea?
Definitely, and we'll get into this because this is where the science comes in. This is where the science comes in, but science with a healthy dose of politics. To be fair. So the lawyers for Peggy's side were able to show a causal link for this. Now, causality in science is very difficult. Correlation is not hard, but causality is extremely difficult to say without question or with a 95% confidence interval, 95% confidence interval that X causes Y is very difficult in science. Very, very difficult in science. And in fact, honestly, it's to say that tobacco causes lung cancer, right? It took almost 60 years of research, and when you go back and read the reports, they say the causal mechanism is there. But that's extremely difficult to do. It's easier to do in the physical sciences, impossible to do in the social sciences. How are you going to do that? Yet they try, right? So I tend to not be a believer in causality in the social sciences. I think it's just too difficult. Physical sciences, you can prove causality, but it takes a lot of research, and there's a lot of effort that has to be done by scientists to do this. And when causality does occur and they can show it to happen, it actually tends to be groundbreaking. And you actually see paradigm shift because of this. Now, problems accumulate for the less powerful group. Problems then reach the national agenda. There's pressure to quote-unquote do something to help the less powerful group. There's a status quo power that wants to prevent the policy change. And then this is where you tend to see the policy battle, so to speak. There's a policy change to help the less powerful group, or there is not a policy change to help the less powerful group, and then it goes back into there. If there is a policy change to help the less powerful group, then the problems don't accumulate, or they stop accumulating. If the policy change does not occur, then the problems keep accumulating. So I wanted to kind of graphically illustrate how these different policy types exist, so that when you go back out there, especially for those of you that are working out there, you will actually now map this conceptually onto what you see in your own work. So that way you understand, when those of you who are AG&R students, and you're going to go into this and you want to understand why policy for the Mojave River is this way, try to understand it in the larger conceptual framework. Was the Mojave adjudication, was it a distributive? Was it a regulatory? Was it a redistributive? How are we going to view this? So that way it gives us a better understanding of why the decisions are made. So you understand policymakers are educated folks. And when they make these decisions, they often make it with a conceptual framework. They try to understand. They try to apply this as well when they're making decisions. So educated people, this is what they do. All right, now let's talk about environmental policy, because environmental policy really stems from the 19th century. And 19th century policies still affect the public interest today. Because these 19th century policies tend to still be in effect in some areas, we often think that they defy common sense. Well, this doesn't make any sense. Why is this occurring? But it's because we often don't understand the history behind the policy that started probably 100 and something years ago. And it's important to understand the history behind why these policies developed in the first place. And its scope has grown even greater. So one of the classic examples that used in environmental policy is that of the Bureau of Land Management that Neville mentioned earlier. The Bureau of Land Management is a behemoth. It manages close to 256 million acres, more than any other federal agency. And this national system of public lands is primarily located in 12 states that you see there, including Alaska. The Bureau has a budget of about $1 billion and administers 700 million acres of subsurface mineral estate throughout the nation. Now, the BLM has a multiple-use mission. Its multiple use is to sustain the health and productivity of the public lands for the use and the enjoyment of both present and future generations. So it has a multiple-use mission, and Neville mentioned that earlier. It has a multiple use. It's not just there to protect wildlife. It serves multiple missions for both this generation and the next. So it accomplishes this by managing a number of activities, including outdoor recreation, livestock grazing, mineral development, and energy production. and in the process also conserving natural, historical, cultural, and other resources on the public land. Yet, because of older policies, because of policies that have been in place are grandfathered in, or the courts have ruled in a certain way, the BLM struggles at many times when it makes decisions to try and please everyone. So the example that I have here up on the board is that of what's happening in Nevada. So the BLM's attempts to balance the needs of interest groups, in this case, has created somewhat of a firestorm of controversy. So the BLM issued its EIR, or Environmental Impact Report, and its Record of Decision, which gave the Southern Nevada Water Authority here a right-of-way across federal public lands to construct a pipeline to bring limited and ancient groundwater from central Nevada and western Utah down to Vegas. And so what you see here is the actual construction of the pipeline and where it's coming from, the aquifers, and bringing it to Vegas. Now, why Vegas?
It's Vegas.
It's Vegas. How else are you going to sit poolside and drink your margaritas, right?
Yeah.
I mean, where's the water going to come from? You gotta think about it. Well, why not get it from Lake Mead? Yeah, what's going on with Lake Mead?
They don't want them.
The Lake Mead levels have dropped to the lowest ever. Yeah, in fact, they're worried about Lake Mead, in fact, being able to actually turn the turbines. They're worried about the water. So what they're doing is they're cutting back on the water that's going to Las Vegas in order to fill up the lake so that way they can keep the turbines. Because power is a little bit more important than water for Vegas, I think.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's pretty close, isn't it? Yeah, I'm sure that, I don't know, we'll have to ask, well, we'll have to ask people who live in Vegas or people who visit Vegas, right?
Yeah.
Which one they think is more important. And so, this Southern Nevada Water Authority proposal, they want to pump at least 27.4 billion gallons of groundwater per year from rural valleys in Nevada and through 250 miles of pipeline to Vegas, at a cost to be estimated by the authority itself in excess of $15.7 billion. It's a very expensive water project, almost rivaling what Brown wants to do, Governor Brown in this state, who wants to bring all the water from Northern California here, is what he's trying to do. And so, which I'm not quite sure it's the right thing to do, but nevertheless, Brown is pushing for it. So, Abby Johnson, who is president of the Great Basin Water Network, she's actually a consultant for the Nuclear Power Authority and consulted on the Yucca Mountain construction where they were going to store all the nuclear waste. She's president of an action network up there in this area. She said, quote, "This decision defies common sense." There's that common sense word again, right? "This is pure folly and short-sightedness. The BLM's own environmental impact statement and thousands of pages of analysis and disclosures confirms that if implemented, the project would result in certain devastation for the environment, ranching families, Native American people, and rural communities." So interestingly enough, what you're seeing here is a reaction that crosses the ideological spectrum. Often when we think of preserving the environment, we think it's some tree-hugging liberal, right? But in this case, very conservative ranchers, very conservative families in rural areas are concerned that their way of life is going to be wiped out. And so they're teaming up with liberal environmental groups to try and block this from happening, and they just filed motion in court this past April to try and prevent, through the court system, to prevent this from happening. So whether or not they're going to succeed is going to be interesting because the Bureau made its decision based on existing policies and existing laws and agreements that have been existing for over 100 years in Nevada. Before there was this idea that Vegas would be a place where people could sunbathe nude. You know, so all these policies exist before Vegas became what it is. And so now policy needs to change. But policy, it's difficult to change, right, when it's become entrenched. So just to give you an idea of what we mean about this. Now, probably perhaps the biggest concern is for the average person who lives in Vegas, the resident or the business, because of the project's astronomical price tag. They're saying that water rates could quintuple because of this. And so Vegas residents aren't too keen on this either. But where's the water going to come from? It's got to come from somewhere. You see what I'm saying? Water has to come from somewhere. It's not falling from the sky. It's got to come from somewhere. And unfortunately, Vegas can't do what Carlsbad's doing. What's Carlsbad doing? They're building a $50 million desalinization plant And Vallecitos Water Authority there is buying 25% of it. So they actually just built a 10-mile pipeline from Carlsbad through Vista to San Marcos, and it's going to feed all of North County, San Diego. So about half of the water, if I'm mistaken, please forgive me. I'm on camera, so forgive me if I'm wrong. I want to say about half of the water for Vallecitos Water Authority is going to come from the desalinization plant. If my numbers are wrong, please forgive me. They're swimming in my head at times. Yeah, but let's just say a good deal. How's that? All right, a good deal is coming from there. Vegas can't do that. So, what's the alternative? What do you suggest?
Move Vegas up north.
Move Vegas up north? Shut down Vegas? That's not going to happen. No way. Obama said, I think in 2009, that people should just take less vacations, or businesses shouldn't have as many conventions, and what happened? The mayor of Vegas at the time, Oscar Goodman, I think he almost put a hit out on it. I mean, seriously, you know? So that's not going to happen.
Do we know why, and this may be a stupid question, but do we know why exactly Lake Mead is receding? Is it just due to pure consumption?
No, actually, it's mostly from a lack of precipitation. Yeah, we're going through a major drought. The drought's not just California, right?
Yeah.
You know, so what do you do?
Say what?
What do we do? Oh, what do we do? Conserve more. Vegas does a really good job of conserving water. And you know, hotels tend to have their own reservoirs. I don't know if you know that or not.
Do they?
Yeah, and they tend to recycle their own water as much as they can, right?
I
You
didn't
know?
know. So
Yeah.
hotels are implementing gray water system?
Oh yeah, hotels are all about it. Water is a precious commodity.
Yeah.
So they're very keen on being efficient with their water use. I mean, to a point, you still want to go frolic in your pool, right? You know, but you pay for that. What do they call it now? Not a hotel fee. They're calling it now when you go to Vegas, and they charge you an extra $20-$30. An amenities fee. Have you heard of this now?
Yeah.
Something like that, right? It really is part of the cost of a room, but they just call it now what are they calling it? A hotel fee, amenities fee? What's that? Leisure fee. There we go. A leisure fee. That's where your money's going. I don't have an answer. Does that make sense? I don't know what this solution is, and it's going to become more acute as more people move into the metropolitan area. You know, Vegas metropolitan area is 1.5 million. It's huge. You know, that includes North Las Vegas. That includes Henderson. That whole area is becoming very populated. It took a break with the recession, but it's going to come back. You know, because if you had your choice of shoveling snow in Buffalo or living in Vegas, where would you live? Buffalo? Most Americans would say the sun. Yeah, what would you do? Neville, you're the expert.
So in all across the Southwest, the couple of things happen, and is conservation. And yeah, there's actually a lot more we can do conservation. We're incredibly wasteful of water, right? We take potable water, drinking water, and we water our plants and flush our toilets. So much we can do. There's a lot we can do with recycling water. So we're taking recycled water from wastewater treatment plants. It's called purple pipe water, and we're putting it back out on the landscapes. Locally, we have cash for grass programs, reduce the lawns.
Which has been very effective.
And locally we've taken a family usage of about 0.75 of an acre foot. Doesn't have to mean anything to anyone. We've dropped it to half of that. Okay, that's just in a few years of very careful conservation. After that, it's actually some very, very, very tough choices that have to happen, because over the Southwest, and this does apply somewhat to Vegas, not quite as much, we have to take water from agriculture. So I just returned from the California Ag Conference in San Luis Obispo, and they're literally shutting the pumps off. So the almond, they call it not almonds, but how do they say it? Almonds? Almonds. The almonds. They're huge groves of almonds that the pumps are getting shut off this week. So we now are going to have less food, and in our country, what that's going to do is obviously raise the price. It won't put any people into starvation necessarily, but the people that depend on some of these staple crops, maybe not almonds, but corn and rice and some of these staple crops, puts them at a relative disadvantage. So we start balancing not wants. A lot of what goes on in Vegas are wants. We start having to balance needs. So water for food is the trade-off, and And so
And
therefore,
you'll see that. You'll see a rise in certain prices in certain commodities. What's the first law of ecology that we talked about last week? Everything is what? Everything is connected to everything. Everything is connected to everything.
This would be helpful, although it's for the same reasons you mentioned, it's not going to happen, but if they could re-adjudicate the allocation of water out of the Colorado River to the various states,
Mhm.
down. And unfortunately, California and Arizona are the big culprits.
Because I worked for Ken Calvert, who was a subcommittee chairman for water resource, and he's the one who actually planned most of that. I was there with him when he planned most of it. Yep. It's politics. Where's Calvert from? Corona. So what do you do?
Get water to California.
You got it. You got it. It's called politics. You don't like it? Grow up. This is how the world works. I don't pretend to be your dad and say, "Oh, it's okay." You know what I mean? This is politics. Calvert's protecting his interests. You gonna fault him for that? Not if you live in California. Yeah, that's right. But if you live in Utah or Nevada, you definitely aren't happy with it. But guess what? Who elects him? Not we the people, right? Who elects Calvert?
We do.
People from Nevada? From Arizona?
We do.
Where's a Calvert a congressperson from? California. Places like South Corona that have really nice lawns.
Yeah, they do.
Really, really nice lawns. So yeah, that's exactly it. That's politics, isn't it? You got it.
The numbers are based on flows that happened decades ago.
Yeah.
It was in better condition.
Absolutely. And those definitely flows are not there. And the science is there. But to acknowledge that science would be to acknowledge a reality that then would have to shift the policy on the ground. And that's difficult to do. Because there are people who are benefiting from the policies being in place. Mike?
Now, couldn't you raise rates considerably for excess water usage while at the same time incentivizing through tax credits or whatnot for water conservation? And maybe like do that. I mean, as far like from everybody across from like small homeowners up to
Definitely. That is called regulatory policy. Notice how you just explained regulatory policy. What are you doing? Using government regulation to do what? Protect the population from itself.
But doing it in such a way where, you know, people, you're not just like, you're not trading water for money, you're not giving people money, but at the same time you're also taking in money for excess water, and
Sure.
hopefully things should.
However, keep in mind that if you raise the rates, what happens to water usage? There's a paradox in water policy that you have to all be aware of. What happens if you raise the rates? Usage goes down, correct? There's a direct inverse correlation between these, or an indirect correlation, I should say. You know, a negative correlation is probably a better phrase. Negative correlation between rates and water usage. Rates go up, water usage goes. However, because these are publicly regulated companies, they have a certain margin of profit that are guaranteed to them under state statutes. Therefore, what happens if water usage keeps dropping? What are they going to do?
Raise your rates.
Keep raising rates. Why?
They can.
So the paradox in water policy is that if you conserve water, what will happen?
What sector?
You will pay more. If you don't conserve water, what will happen? You will pay less. That's the actual paradox in water policy. I don't know if you're aware of that or not. Yes, now you are. Yes, so you will always pay more if you use less, which is counterintuitive. Because what's your intuition want to say?
Yep.
That if you use less, you should. However, because it's a publicly regulated utility, it has the right to create and make a certain profit that is guaranteed. Because it has a natural monopoly. Because you don't want everybody bringing a water pipe to your house. You don't want certain corporations competing over, let's say, natural gas, electricity. Do you see what I'm saying? Because you don't want them running their own utilities to your house. And every time you change a provider, what happens? They got to rip out the utilities. You see what I'm saying? So because these are natural monopolies, they're regulated and they're given a certain amount of profit margin. And so the paradox is if you use less water, what's going to happen in order to keep that margin there? They're going to raise your rates. Yeah, so kind of a paradox. I don't know if you've ever thought about this before. But that's true of all naturally regulated monopolies that do exist because of our utilities.
Well, it sounds like we'd be the ones conserving, and then the utility companies don't really care, they're gonna raise your rates because they aren't making as big of a
No, it's not
profit?
that they care. They actually have very strict regulations, and most of them actually, if they can conserve, they get bonuses. It's a very complicated system on how energy, water, and all these natural monopolies, they actually function.
But it's as
you
though
know?
they don't want you to conserve, because if you conserve, they lose money.
No,
So
no.
therefore their rates are
If they
therefore
conserve, the rate, if you conserve, they get more benefits from the government and rates go up. So it's in their interest to conserve. What am I trying to tell you? What's the paradox here? Intuition says what? That if you use less, what'll happen? You'll pay less, right? But what will really happen if you use less?
Which is one way to know.
You'll pay more.
What-
Do you see what I'm saying? That's it's a paradox.
Wouldn't
It's
that-
not supposed to happen.
Wouldn't that be offset though by giving tax credits, as I said, for conservation?
To who?
Well, I guess if you're talking about for the water company, then no, they're not getting.
I mean,
tax
to who?
credits.
Yeah, who are you talking about? You giving it to the people?
Yeah.
To the people. I mean, you know who, right?
Yeah.
It would depend.
Yeah, give it to the people.
You know, it depends. Corporations ask for those kind of tax credits all the time. And they get them, depending on the corporation. Depending on the corporation, depending on the situation, depending on the economic climate, depending on who's in charge. Just being honest with you. You know? Yes?
The paradox that you're mentioning is kind of like a normal government mentality in the sense that the school year is coming to an end and you are allotted $5,000, but if you only use 4,000,
You get
you only get 4,000
1,000 next year. Yes,
even
correct.
though you're trying to save the
Correct.
money. You found measures of saving money.
Correct.
Not to say that, hey, I might actually need that 5,000 the next fiscal year.
And so what Lynn says leads to a norm in political science that we all understand. Government is not about efficiency. Never has been, never will be. And it shouldn't be. Government is not about efficiency, and if you want it to be about efficiency, then you shouldn't even be in this room, because we heavily subsidize you to be in this room. It is inefficient for you to be in this room. Inefficient. Because right now you pay $46 a unit. The true cost, according to the Chancellor's Office, is $196 per unit. And 87% of all Victor Valley College students are on the BOG waiver, which means they pay nothing. It is highly inefficient for you to sit in this room for me to teach you. It's highly inefficient for you guys to go to Cal State San Bernardino. Do you want to know the true cost of for Cal State San Bernardino? Who said they were from Oaxaca, Mexico? Right? Do you pay out-of-state costs?
Luckily not, because
What would happen if you had to pay out-of-state costs? Would you go? Probably not, right? Yeah. Out-of-state costs, out-of-state students pay the true cost of going to Cal State San Bernardino, and that's usually about what? It's triple 3,000 a semester, what you guys are 2,300 a quarter. So 6 times 3, they had 18,000 a year.
yeah, it doesn't a year.
Yeah. Right? UC students pay 5,000 a quarter. Out of state or out of country, Chinese foreign students pay 15,000 a quarter to go to UC Riverside. It is inefficient to have you in this room, but yet we do it. Why?
Because it's an investment.
It's called equity. The other E that he was talking about, equity. It is in our interest as a society to have you sit in this room and have somebody like me Olivier. Why?
It'll help the various sectors.
Because
It'll
if you
help
get an
business.
education and you can critically think, then you become a taxpayer and we become wealthier as a state. That's why California has always attracted talent, because we heavily subsidize education. Why do you think every smart Asian person and every smart Latino person wants to immigrate and come here?
It's the best university.
Because they can get a cheap education and they stay and they produce. It's not a secret. Businesses know this. Corporations are screaming for immigration. They're screaming for the smart ones to come over. They're not dumb. Corporations are the smart. The business folks are the smart ones. They get this. That's everyone else who doesn't get this. Government is never about efficiency, never will be. And if it is about efficiency, you shouldn't exist as a college. We should not be doing this. Understand that, because it's a key concept in this. U.S. Forestry Service is an extremely inefficient industry. Yet we have it. Why? Because it's equitable. There's fairness involved. It's important for us as a society to protect our wilderness, our forest, to manage it properly. Do you see this? It's in our interests as a society that are tough to quantify, difficult to put into dollars. Do you see what I'm saying? So good questions. Very good questions. This is basic tenets in politics. Government is not efficient, never will be. And if you expect it to be, good luck. Have fun with that. Because it never will be. It's not made to be. Actually, you can measure this. It's called the Pareto optimal frontier. You can actually measure this. Economists do this. They can measure the exact efficiency. They can tell you how close it comes to the frontier. I can show you graphically how this works if you want. because it truly does exist. Businesses are efficient. They meet the frontier and exceed it. Why are businesses efficient? So what happens if they're not? They don't survive long, do they? Yeah. And often what happens is we want to apply a business model to government, and what happens when we do that? We lose equity. We lose fairness in the process. So there comes a point where people say, hey, no, this isn't right. No. Yes, we accept some inefficiency. Of course, what happens if there's gross inefficiencies in government? You get Mexico. You get a country that doesn't function. So we don't want that either. Does that make sense? So we don't want a complete business model for our government, yet at the same time we don't want complete inefficiency. We prefer to have some kind of proper balance. And that proper balance varies from society to society on what we think is best. It'll vary from state to state in the United States on what they think is best. So, part of environmental policy, it also means defining the environmental problems and forecasting environmental conditions. This is really difficult to do, and I was mentioning this with the science earlier. For example, what is considered a carcinogen? How do we come up with this definition? How did we get here? Who defined it? What now is considered carcinogenic? And if carcinogenic is shown to be a causality or a causal mechanism for cancer, what do we do about it? And honestly, there's many different interpretations within the scientific community itself as to whether the harm or risk involved in a given level of pollution or exposure to a particular chemical substance. There's a lot of differences in the scientific community about, is it actually carcinogenic? And that's a fair question. And new science can always come up that could refute previous science. This is what science is all about. Now, the nature of modeling future events with many unknown parameters, involves a certain amount of inevitable uncertainty. I do modeling, formal modeling of social and political phenomena, mathematical modeling, and I gotta tell you, it's a pain. We're trying to predict behavior, and it's really difficult to do. Extremely difficult to do. It's easier to do it in the physical sciences. In fact, there was an article some of you would be interested in that says that God gave physics the easy problems. Because it's easy to do this. You can set up these predictive models in science, and you can somewhat accomplish them. In the social sciences, it's nearly impossible to do this. But let me give you an example. A lot of our environmental policy will depend on our world population trends and projection. Would you guys agree? So where is it projecting towards? We're right at around 6 billion people. You'd say 7 billion people. We're at, Nev? Worldwide?
People say 8.
Somewhere around 8, right? So let's go with 8.
Yeah.
Where are we headed?
9 billion since the 1 billion that's probably hiding out there.
No 1 billion that's hiding somewhere? Let's go with 8 billion. I like that, and 1 billion hiding somewhere. Probably in Brazil watching soccer.
These guys aren't from here. They don't know where I'm BSing.
All right, yeah.
They're
They're not foreigners, like we are. All right. So the high estimate is 15 billion. The low estimate is that the population is actually going to drop closer to 6 billion. Most likely, we're going to end up probably around 10 billion. Will forecasting population projections help us in determining environmental policy? Absolutely. Last year, when we went to the Mojave Water Agency level, they were trying to predict how many people are going to move up here in the next 20 years. Because right now, the high desert, including Barstow, has around 400,000 people. No, does that sound about right?
That's right.
So what happens if we bring an additional 100,000 people up here? What impact and stress does that have on the resources up here in the desert? A lot. But the Mojave Water Agency is planning as if 100,000 people are coming up here. Sometimes they're wrong. And last year when we went, they were very honest. They had put these models in based on 2005 projections. And what happened in 2008? The Great Recession. And actually the population ceased to grow up here in the high desert. In fact, it even shrank. So they had to change their scenarios based on that. So it's tough to forecast. Does that make sense? Really difficult to forecast. And this is the problems that people have with global warming. Is that it's difficult to forecast so far out what's going to happen. Not that there isn't correlation, but correlation is not causality. Does that make sense? And I've read the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they are offering causality. The 700 and something scientists that have signed off on it are offering causality. But it's difficult to make that. It's difficult to make that assumption. Very, very difficult. All right. Mike, I'm sorry. Get your hand raised.
With population growth, isn't that basically at odds with environmental issues with with the more people, with the more growth that we have, the more environmental issues that we'll have with that. While at the same time, don't we need growth to grow the economy?
You know, it depends on the type of view that you take. So sustainability often has an anthropocentric point of view, which often offends deep ecologists or those who take a biocentric point of view. So an anthropos in Greek means person. So all we're doing in sustainable development is taking a human-centered approach. And so when you say, you know, that there's a zero-sum game, right? That growth automatically has to mean what?
Harm to the environment.
Harm to the environment.
Population growth.
That, but the thing is, that's a natural assumption to make, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Do you see what I'm saying? So the Mojave Water Agency is planning appropriately to try to accommodate this increase. So there will be an impact, but the impact doesn't necessarily have to be as stressful as one would assume it to be.
And there's got to be a calculable limit too to the amount of population.
It's called the
growth
carrying
that's sustained.
capacity. That's called the carrying capacity.
The carrying.
Carrying, C-A-R-R-Y, carry, like carry, baby carry. Carrying capacity. That's what it's called. I don't know if they teach you guys that in biology or not. Yeah, fair enough. You know, it's the carrying capacity of the Earth, carrying capacity of the Mojave Desert region. You know, what is the carrying capacity? And I don't know, what is the carrying capacity of the region up here? Do they even know?
No.
I don't think anybody's ever calculated that.
300,000.
Huh?
300,000.
There's too many.
Do you know the statistic that's from? Do you have a report or
I
something?
just pulled it out of the air.
The best report of all, the ass, right? So I don't know what it is. I have no idea what the carrying capacity is here. You know, it's a highly variable. What's that?
So I'll find out.
If one exists, I don't think anybody's bothered to do
Well,
those
what
type
do
of
you base
calculations
it
here.
on?
Have you ever run across something like
What,
this?
what we do know.
Wouldn't be a bad idea.
What we
There you
do
go,
know-
next project, Kelsey Zambino.
What we do
So
know
what's
in
the point of it?
population studies,
Quiz
though,
later.
in population biology, that populations go, they reach the carrying capacity, and if they exceed that, really bad things happen. We normally have boom and busts. And so they don't just level off, things collapse.
Mhm.
And that's what we're most concerned about.
That is called a Malthusian scenario.
Yeah.
Malthusian scenario. The population exceeds carrying capacity and disaster happens.
Well,
Malthusian scenario.
in calculating that, wouldn't you at least go for an extremely high number where you know, that, like say it was like, you know, the high desert can't sustain 10 billion, something ridiculous, 10 million people, something ridiculous, and then work your way down from there to like somehow come to.
You know, the
more
local
reasonable
agencies are pretty
capacity.
logical. I mean, they make, you know, rational guesses, rational estimates. They're guesses, but they're estimates. They're rational. You know, they said last year, Neville can correct me, I think they said they're planning for about 100,000 more people to move up here in the next 20 years. So they're preparing ahead of time. They could be right, they could be wrong. And how are they preparing? What are they asking for us to conserve water? Right?
Conserve water, there are all kinds of plans for them to get more water from the California aqueduct.
Mm-hmm.
We're storing water underground.
Yep.
It's the integrated management plan that they just had approved. In fact, we're helping them approve it in the Resource Conservation District next week. So they've got a whole slew of sustainable practices, what
Yep.
I would call them, sustainable water practices that they're implementing.
Now, as defining the problem also means partly assessing the risks. Understand that risk is inherent in any activity. Now, the question of acceptable risk involves personal decisions and trade-offs at individuals are willing to make in order in their own lives. When you put that in regards to environmental policy, there may be involuntary risks where the individual has no control. So in these situations, government organizations or other third parties often make assessment of risk for society as a whole. Now, for practical, political, and economic reasons, guys, it's impossible to eliminate all forms of pollution from the environment. Zero discharge, as attractive as it might sound, is in most instances nearly impossible to obtain. Furthermore, even when you can obtain zero discharge, the cost of removing the last few remaining units of pollution from the environment can be astronomical. Therefore, acceptable levels of pollution and risks to human health are required in any form of environmental management. And that's not often what we want to hear, right? When we think we want to protect ourselves, we want zero what? Risk. But is that possible? No. Risk is inherent in any activity. Just being in this room that was built when? In the 60s, Neville?
This thing? Yeah.
Yeah, and an earthquake happens, carries some inherent risk with it, doesn't it? If I scared you, I'm sorry about that. Yeah. But think about that. There's risk in every activity that you take. It's a good thing you got a fire guy back here who can rescue us. You know? So what the policymakers have to do is they have to prioritize risks. In other words, they have to determine which risks are more important to address and which are less important to address. So prioritization involves the use of what we call rational decision making. But rationalities collide and choices become what's known in policymaking as intransitive, when there could be a number of rational grounds to support a particular policy. So normally what you see is a collision in policymaking between what's called technical rationality and social rationality. Technical rationality is what the folks from Cal State San Bernardino do. The bio majors, the folks who study practices, the folks who are actually out there measuring, who are doing work. They have reasoned choices that compare alternatives with respect to their ability to prove effective solutions. They use science to try and reason choices for policymakers. This is technical rationality. Social rationality is when you try to reason choices that compare alternatives with the ability to improve or maintain social institutions. That's not often based on what scientists want, but often based on what society wants. And often there is a clash. So for example, if you look at the AQMD chart to the left, very quickly what do you see? That policies put in place to battle smog have worked, has it not? And what have you seen in the number of days, it says here, that exceed the 8-hour federal ozone standard? Those number of days have dropped. Now, is anybody from Riverside? I moved to Riverside back in 1979, 1980. They wouldn't let us outside to play most of the year because the smog was so bad you could cut it with a knife. It was that thick.
That was bad enough even when I was in middle school. They wouldn't let us play because the wildfire smoke was so bad that kids were passing out.
It's just the smog was so thick in Riverside. You go to Riverside, is it still smoggy? Yeah. Nowhere near as smoggy as it used to be. So should we keep continuing with regulations to lower smog days?
Yeah.
Sure, right? But at what cost? And what is that butting up against? A major social institution we have in Southern California. That social institution that we revolve our lives around and is a part of everything that we do is called the automobile. You want the quickest way to remove smog? What should you do?
Ride a bicycle.
Yeah, yeah, honestly, yeah, remove the automobile. Go clear it up like that. Is that going to happen? Probably not. Why?
Because people are lazy.
No, it's not. They're not lazy at all. No, I'm not as cynical as that. It's part of a social institution. No, it's part of who we are. If my son is sick and I got to get him to the hospital, what am I going to do?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. If I got to go to work, what am I going to do? Do you see what I'm saying? I'm not an evil person because I make these decisions. It is a social institution. That's it. And so what happens is in technological rationality butts heads with social rationality. Because if you're going to tell a person, give up your car and ride your bike, yet you have a son who cannot walk,
Oh, yeah,
what do you do then? You see what I'm saying? Yeah, then all of a sudden technological, when you're a politician, you got to make a decision. Who do you think you're going to hear it from the most? The mom or the scientist? Think about that logically. Who are you going to hear from? The scientist or the mom?
The mom.
Who's going to be louder, you think? The mom. By far. The suburban mom and the beast of a car is far louder than the scientist. And probably they vote and the scientist does not. Keep that in mind. All right, a couple more slides. So what is an acceptable risk? I don't know. The answer to that question is more political in substance than it is scientific, to be honest with you. The average person might assume that objective scientific analysis would determine acceptable levels of risk, but that is not always the case. Risk selection and resolution is not objective, but inevitably is subject to the results of the political process. It is policy making at its essence. So politicians and policymakers will compare risks, set priorities when it comes to environmental policy. And the process of a cost-benefit analysis is often used to set priorities among policies. And as the name suggests, cost-benefit analysis is about weighing the costs and the benefits of different activities. Now, the implications of cost-benefit analysis for environmental policymaking are very serious, especially in relation to risk assessment. Ultimately, what policymakers want to do is avoid marginal utility. This is a concept that at a certain level, the costs begin to outweigh the benefits of an action. So you don't want to get to the point where you put in a policy and the costs outweigh the benefits. That's called marginal utility, and you don't want that to happen as a policymaker, because then society disapproves of the action at that point. Now, so essentially, the last slide here, what is environmental politics? Politics, ultimately, guys, is about the collective choices we make as a society. So environmental politics is the collective choices we make about the environment as a society. That's truly what environmental politics is. And there have been significant fundamental changes that have occurred in environmental policy over the past 4 decades. And for those of you that are interested in this, knowing the history of these changes is important for us understanding where policy is at this moment and where policy is going in the future. So hopefully I didn't take up, Neville's not here good, so he's not going to hit me with the whip for going over. And so thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And if you have any questions? Yes, sir.
Just thinking of, discussing care capacity up here in high desert, from a population standpoint, and what would be the limiting resource. And you put that more into an environmental realm than we're seeing lately. There's the drought conditions, things getting drier, down the hill, more places burning, more wind. They may influence people over the next decade to try the desert out more than they normally would.
Oh, I didn't think about that. Sure.
If it gets severe enough, right now it's not severe enough. But if the majority of the acreage, because of the drought, because of increased wind, starts burning, they're going to be looking for other places to live.
Okay.
And that's going to be an environmental.
Sure, because down the hill we're as built out as it can get, right?
Yeah.
And so the only place to go is up. And you see that in downtown LA. It's going up. I mean, they have 53 new buildings under construction in downtown LA. So if you can't go out, what do? You go up. But almost what's happening, and this is something I worked with my dissertation advisor, Karthik Ramakrishnan at UCR, was that almost what you see in the Inland Empire is it's almost formed its own concentric circle. What we mean by that is normally we see Riverside as part of the larger circle of Los Angeles, but Riverside's almost become its own circle because of the universities, because of its population, 300,000. So what happens is people in Riverside, actually in that area, they move out. And so when they're going to move out because it's built out, where are they going to move to? And the answer is the desert.
It's more of a catastrophic scenario, but
I'm not
we
sure.
could be on the beginning of a cycle that's going to promote a lot of people to be thinking along those lines.
It's interesting. I've never thought about that before, that because of the wildfires and the environmental damage, they're going to seek to come up here where there's less environmental damage or less possibility of catastrophe. Fair enough. I live down in San Marcos, and those fires hit right next to my home, and we were evacuated for 5 days. I don't see my wife going anywhere. I'm just being very honest with you. I don't see my wife trading San Marcos for Oro Grande.
No.
You see what I'm saying? I really don't. I'm just being very honest with you.
It
You know?
wouldn't necessarily be to Oro Grande, but it might be to places like Phoenix or Tucson.
And I like the
that,
desert.
yeah.
She doesn't. I love the desert. I want to retire in Palm Springs. But she absolutely hates the desert with a passion. So I don't know. But this is anecdotal, right? But it's a very good point that you bring up. Very good point. Yes, sir.
I just want to know, do you have any books you would recommend on this topic?
Oh, gosh. Where do you want me to start?
Basics.
Sure. The book that I have is called The Environmental Policy, not my book, excuse me. The book that I use by Zachary Smith is called The Environmental Policy Paradox. I think you would really enjoy it, especially if you're a little bit more advanced. If you guys are a little bit more advanced, you guys are juniors and seniors, I'm assuming? So you have more introduction, right? So then this would be a good book for you guys. It's called The Environmental Policy Paradox, and what Zachary Smith does is kind of go through, and the students are reading it right now in my class. It's a great book to pick up. There's also Green Giants. I'll give you, before I leave, I'll give you my card. Just email me, and then I'll give you a list of books. Just, if the email takes a couple weeks, please forgive me. Because when I get home, my 5-year-old doesn't allow me to do anything. Except concentrate on her. And sing Frozen songs. I hate it. Let it go. Right? Oh, God, it's horrible. Anybody else have 5-year-old girls running around singing?
Naked. You gotta do it naked.
I do naked? Yeah, that's not going to happen. All right.
With them, not us.
Yes. Any other questions? Any other questions? Is Neville out there? Did Neville have anything planned after this?
Yeah,
Yeah,
he's talking.
He's talking?
He's.
Oh dear.
Going to?
You guys
Said you were going to.
better not get this on camera.
Yeah.
All right, if no other questions, and again, thank you very much. I don't know what the schedule is, you'll have to forgive me. I'm assuming Neville wants to wrap things up. So on behalf of Mr. Slade, if we could all stick around and wait a couple of minutes, I'll go find out where he's at. So, thank you.